It's a real pleasure to welcome Amanda Stevens to the Caring CEO podcast. Welcome, Amanda.
Hey, Graham. Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. What does care in the workplace mean to you?
This is a great question, and it's a question I've been doing deep thinking on over the last 12 months or so, researching and writing my new book, Radical Customer Obsession. And as a result of the research that I did and the thinking that I did and the case studies I looked at, I realized that there is such an intrinsic link between employee experience and customer experience, which is what my passion and expertise is about. And a lot of the case studies and examples that I researched for this book demonstrated that link. And I think that care in the workplace is really the critical foundation for ultimately creating great customer experiences, because at the end of the day, customer experiences are really just employee experiences played out one at a time.
That's such a good point and something that I often talk about. There's a engagement survey question by Gallup, which is my supervisor or someone at work seems to care about me as a person. And the more people that strongly agree with that, the higher the productivity, the higher the profit, the higher the customer service levels, and the longer people stay there. So this isn't a idle theory. It's been shown to work in a very rigorous way.
And it also, of course, works in reverse. And we've all seen examples where a management team or a CEO gets super excited about the potential of the customer experience or being a customer-centric brand. And so they go on this journey of, a flashy ad campaign or a brand promise to customers. And yet the disconnect with what's going on internally shows very, very quickly. And that disconnect is often the thing that brings a brand undone, and certainly means that the promise to customers is certainly not authentic or genuine, which I just think is pretty transparently demonstrated these days.
Yeah, I think it was Peter Drucker that said culture eats strategy for lunch. And you can have the best strategy, but if people aren't engaged with it, they don't feel they're part of it, it's all just words, isn't it? It doesn't really embody itself in people.
That's right. That's right. And I think, the best, most, and you've interviewed a lot of these very people, the most caring CEOs realize that the experience does start from the inside out and the top down.
What have been some of the best customer experience companies that you've worked with? And I guess behind it, what do they do with their people, which seems to be different?
Great question. So to that point about aligning employee experience and employee culture, internal culture with ultimately the customer experience, I was really fortunate last year to work with Terry White Chemmart, one of Australia's biggest pharmacy chains, and their market research identified this gap in the market and this opportunity for them as a brand to take a promise to market to consumers around care, which is a pretty big, bold promise. And they really wanted to unpack and explore and tease out this concept of care and what it means to consumers and the ever-changing role that pharmacy plays in families and communities. But before they took that campaign to market, they realized that they needed to do the internal piece first. The management team were very aligned, but they needed to make sure that their team, their network of pharmacists and retail assistants across the country, could bring that promise to life in pharmacy, in store, because it's all very well to have a flashy ad campaign, as I said, and an emotional TV commercial that promises this. But if your experience then at a store level is disconnected from that, that's actually more damaging to a brand than, a lack of care from start to finish. So they, understood that internal piece was the most important thing. So before they aired a TV commercial, we put their entire network of pharmacists and retail assistants through this very rigorous internal training to educate them and empower them, more importantly, to really take ownership of the customer experience and take situations that might be perceived as reacting and responding and really taking them a step further to caring and connecting and really clearly demonstrating and educating and, as I said, empowering them around what that difference is so that they could have a sense of ownership over the customer experience, which ultimately made the end brand campaign a lot more successful and certainly aligned, and it certainly had a really positive impact on the business.
And they have quite a few franchisees, don't they? How did they how did they help that happen necessarily directly under the control of Kenmark? How did they make that happen?
Yeah, great question. I think it was educating the franchisees that this wasn't just a warm and fuzzy campaign, and it wasn't a marketing opportunity that identified. It was really, this is what they wanted the brand DNA of Terry White Kenmart to represent in the marketplace. And that empowerment piece was so important because it very much relied on the pharmacists and everyone, in that store to bring that to life at a store level. So I think they championed that and also made the business case for that promise and that focus on customer experience. As I said, it's not just about the warm and fuzzies. They were they were able to demonstrate the very clear business case and financial and fiscal benefit ultimately to the franchisee for them, going the extra mile and stepping up customer experience in store.
Yeah, it's a great example. And I was fortunate to work a long time ago with Ramsay Healthcare, and Pat Greer was the CEO at that time, and I've had Pat on the show here. Pat really wanted to embed care into the way that they did business. And what he did was put together a visioning workshop or at Uluru and basically say they were struggling at the time. The banks were knocking on the doors, but he said, I want us to be recognized by our peers to be the best hospital operators in Australia. And he and his leadership team, which were the CEO of the hospitals, the director of finance, the director of nursing, came up with, their first draft. But what I think made it really interesting was that he then had me take it round to their hospitals at the time. There's only like 13, but they really reality tested it and made a few changes and what have you. And it was unbelievable. In 15 years, the Australian stock market over that period, Pat was CEO, grew by 460%. But Ramsay grew by, 5,600%. And their vision was people caring for people. And, did that with their doctors, their patients, their family, and what have you. And, it's wonderful to see that, people are realizing that this is critical to having a good customer experience, but also a very good shareholder experience if you do the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, customer experiences don't happen in a vacuum. And I think what you've touched on there that I write extensively about in the book is, a culture of collaboration. And caring CEOs and successful CEOs don't make decisions in a vacuum either. They, what differentiates them from perhaps not CEOs that don't perform as well in a whole range of different metrics is that they invite both their team and their customers in to almost co-create and co-parent the brand, if you like. And we know the research shows that the more employees are involved in designing the customer experience, the more empowered they feel and the more likely they are to deliver on that and go the extra mile when it matters. And similarly with customers, I'm amazed how many brands I work with and, a CEO or as, someone will in the management team will say, what do you think our customers want? My response, it sounds simple, but it's not simplistic. My response is always, have you asked them? So yeah, inviting I'm not just talking about focus groups. I'm talking about really getting your customers involved in, customer journey mapping, taking your team on what we call customer safari days, where they literally get to walk in the shoes of a customer and see the brand through the customer's eyes. And those kind of collaborative initiatives and collaborative environments, we know just foster so much more creativity and innovation.
You may have heard of Connor Menswear. They have, I think, about 200 shops around Australia. But interestingly, they went out to their customers and their staff and asked them, what's a cause you'd like to be involved with? And it came down to mental health. And so they spoke to Beyond Blue and Are You OK? And explored going down that track. And, for whatever reason, they just found Are You OK? To be a bit more entrepreneurial, a bit faster moving. But, so they'd involve their customers and also their staff in deciding that sector. But then they asked their staff, what could we do? How can we support Are You OK? And so they came up with creating a mobile phone wallet where, the Are You OK logo was on there, and you have a little card in there which had all the emergency numbers, Lifeline, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm.
And it became part of their DNA because the staff had come up with it, every time they'd check out a customer, they'd say, I'd like to give you this on behalf of Are You OK? And then ask, would you like to make a donation? And then they would at that point of sale. And it just became so integral. They've been, I think, probably the top sponsor of Are You OK for about the last 7 or 8 years.
Mm.
Far smaller than any of the big corporate brands out there. But, I really believe it was part of, having the customers and also the employees involved. And it also then contributed to, of course, engagement and culture in the shop.
And I think that example speaks so beautifully to the power of collaboration, but also the law of reciprocity. Kind of weren't just, coming up with an initiative or a campaign. It was very much integral, and it also involved supporting their customers and their community. And I think when you can have that two-way reciprocity that says, this is something that we're not just doing, that we actually care about, and we care about our customers, the boomerang effect, it's not why they're doing it, but the boomerang effect on their brand will be infinite.
Very much so. Amanda, you were once Young Australian of the Year.
I thought you were going to say, oh, you were once young.
Once young. And you're now one of the most successful female speakers in Australia. Would you mind just telling our listeners a little bit about that journey, why you've received that award all those years ago and what you've done since then?
Yeah, great. And the two kind of pathways are very closely linked, because it was because of winning that award that I got into speaking a little bit by accident. So when I won that award, it was for business achievement in New South Wales. I had started a marketing agency at the age of 21 in Sydney, moved to town, had no contacts or networks. I just had blind ambition and probably irrational confidence at that time. And when I won that award, I was asked to speak at a whole bunch of events, and I was terrible. I was nervous. I'd be vomiting before I went on stage. But every time I spoke at one of those events, we would get business or clients for the agency, because I was just really telling the story about our business and what we did differently in our business model. So my initial path to speaking was, quite a selfishly commercial one. It was simply that if I'm really bad at this and we're getting clients, imagine if I was really good. So I went and found a speaking coach, and I just said to him, if I'm going to do this, I want to be really good at it. And so I worked intensively with him for 2 years, and it was just a case of the better I got at it, the more I enjoyed it, the more I enjoyed it, the better I got at it. And, I didn't know back then that speaking was even a business or a career or an option to earn a living. So that certainly opened my eyes to the industry, and I just had found my passion. And so I ended up selling my agency to focus on speaking, which is, for me, standing on stage and impacting lots of people at once sounded much more fun than dealing with 28 staff, and some days felt like I was running a kindergarten. So when the opportunity came to sell that business, I certainly grabbed it with both hands, and the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, and I understand on that journey, you took a trip to an island where you met Richard Branson, and that gave you, quite an insight, which you brought back to Australia.
Yeah, it was really interesting, because I had this opportunity. I'd been invited to this leadership retreat at Necker Island, which is where Richard Branson lives and operates his businesses from. But the decision to go, was obviously an incredible opportunity, but the decision to go was not easy. I had an 18-month-old baby. It was the longest I'd ever been away from him. It's the furthest place. Like, if you look at it on a map, you literally can't get a place that's further away from Australia. It's like 5 flights in 33 hours. So the anxiety of being that far away, it was quite overwhelming, but, it was a really good lesson for me. And it was quite a transformative, life-changing week, because, just immersing myself, or having the chance to be immersed in that kind of environment, and, dealing with all of the imposter syndrome, if you like, that came with that. I remember when we arrived at Necker, and it's quite imposing and overwhelming. I just had this wave of panic and, just, who am I? I nearly jumped in the ocean and drowned myself. Like, who am I to be here? Who am I? Like, who do I think I am? And then I just kind of had to have a chat to myself and sort of say, well, you're here now. Who are you not to be here? And I think I've met lots of, really successful entrepreneurs and leaders who've all had those moments in life. And it's just a reminder that when we do take that leap of faith and really do, throw ourselves out of the comfort zone, that's where often the really cool stuff happens. And it was quite an amazing week just in terms of being surrounded by some just incredible human beings, including obviously Sir Richard himself, and a conversation that I had with him on that trip, which I write about in the opening pages of my book, really changed my perception around business. And it certainly, I think, helped me solidify my path to being for this passion that I have about customer experience. Because at that stage, he was sharing the kind of behind the scenes journey around Virgin Voyages, which they were just developing at that stage. This was 2018. And he was sort of telling the story about how, he used to get invited on lots of cruises and he'd always say no because the thought of going on a cruise was just icky. It just wasn't his thing, as it isn't for a lot of people. And it led him to this path, and this is how he's built so many successful brands and businesses, is curiosity and frustration. And this, kind of mantra of his is that curiosity and frustration make the best businesses. Because if you're curious about your customers, first and foremost, and you're curious about an industry or a sector, and then you're curious, more importantly, about the frustrations that people have with that category, that can often lead to innovation, creativity, and in his case, a brand that disrupted and redefined that entire sector. And obviously the Virgin Voyages story is now history, and it's redefined that category. And people who would never have considered going on a cruise, booking their third and fourth and fifth Virgin Voyager cruise, because he's reimagined everything that people hate about cruising and just flipped the switch on it, and as a result has built another very successful Virgin brand.
And that concept of curiosity and frustration, how do you apply that to your speaking clients now?
Good question. I think it's really it certainly shaped my content, and it's, certainly shaped a lot of the messaging in the new book around being radically customer obsessed. It actually starts with curiosity. So curiosity is something I talk a lot about in my keynotes and workshops. And frustration is really about, understanding what is frustrating your customers. And, the reason for this book, and that I've poured my heart and soul into it for the last 12 months, is that I think there's this really pertinent opportunity right now for brands and businesses across every sector, and more importantly, CEOs and leaders, to create a competitive advantage by firstly understanding how consumers are changing, how humans are changing, and that obviously that change is happening at the most accelerated rate we've ever seen. So if you can really understand and get into the hearts and minds of your consumers and understand what it is that's frustrating them and how you can potentially innovate or re-engineer your customer experience, that is more important often than your product or service research and development, because you can have the best product and service in the world, but if the customer experience you're wrapping around that is ordinary, then it's irrelevant how good your product or service is. And because we're in this era of commoditization, someone can copy your product or service, very quickly now, whether it's a physical product or a service. So the customer experience right now, I think, is the greatest opportunity to grow a business, to grab market share and, future-proof a brand.
I understand you speak about the customer experience hierarchy. What is that?
The customer experience hierarchy is really understanding, the human needs and what your customers want. And it might be slightly different for different brands and different businesses in different categories, but it's really recognizing that ultimately we want to feel cared for, we want to feel understood, and we want our needs in many respects to now be met frictionlessly, but almost preemptively. So the best brands and businesses in the world now, the ones that are winning, are the ones that embrace this philosophy. It's actually a Japanese philosophy of omotenashi, which is to be of service, not to be servant, but to be of service without expecting anything in return. The literal translation is to look wholeheartedly after our guests. And I think that brands and businesses that double down and fully embrace this ethos will win the battle for relevance, because that's where the customer experience hierarchy is heading. Because we're so used to now our needs being met so quickly, but also anticipated by brands like, Uber and Amazon and Spotify. All of those brands have completely changed expectations and shifted our expectations around wait times, around preemptive and about anticipatory things. We now think about a product or service and then it appears in our feed. It feels very clairvoyantish, but that's just the baseline reality of the world we're living in now. So yeah, anticipating and being preemptive and thinking 2 steps ahead of your customer, that's now kind of mandatory.
Mm. You mentioned earlier about your son Ollie, and I know at some of the time in he's now 8, as I understand it. You're a single mum. You travel a lot to speak. How do you manage that with a young son?
Yeah, good question. I get asked this a lot, actually. So I became a single mum when I was 10 weeks pregnant, and it was obviously a pretty scary time. My parents have passed away. It's just me. I've got no kind of family or financial plan B. And it was actually Lisa McGuinness-Smith, who's, regarded as the godmother of speaking. I sort of said to her, what am I going to do? And she said, you're in the best position and the best profession you could be to juggle this, motherhood and working, because you're just going to scoop your baby up and travel with him. And I took him pretty much everywhere with me he took his 100th flight when he was 20 months old. And I just had a really, really tight system. I had nannies in every state. And, interestingly, 2018 was the first year I cracked $1 million with a baby in tow. So I think it was just having the right advice, having the right mentors, having the right systems, and just, realizing that I was in a really fortunate position, because speaking is obviously, it's a lot of travel involved, but I was really only ever away from him for that hour that I was on stage. So it meant that I could be essentially a full-time mum and also earn a really good living.
But they don't fit neatly into a little time section, do they? And sometimes they're sick or all that sort of thing. So there must have been examples like that when you had to confront.
Oh yeah, look, I'm not saying it was all rainbows and butterflies and it was easy every single day, but and I had the thing I did learn, interestingly, during that time was just how judgmental people are. And I feel like, parents, but particularly mothers, I think, in many respects feel that we damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. Particularly female CEOs and leaders, they're often asked, how do you juggle it? And, it must be hard being away from the kids. And I very rarely hear someone ask a male leader or CEO or speaker that. I listened to a podcast the other day with a female founder, and she co-founded this quite big tech business with a male co-founder. And she was asked, how do you juggle it all and how do you deal with imposter syndrome? And she said it was probably the 20th time I'd been asked that question, and my male co-founder has never been asked that question.
Wow.
And the people, I got trolled a few times if I was, posting stuff on Instagram about traveling with Ollie. I'd have people say, what about his routine? I'm like, he has a routine. But then I often think those same people who were judging me would probably judge me if I put him into childcare and took a full-time job. So I think, we've all got a responsibility to celebrate people, mothers, leaders, CEOs who make decisions that they think are best for their family and are able to, juggle it all. It's not perfect, but life's not perfect. Business isn't perfect. Parenthood's not perfect. But yeah, I look back on I look back on, and I've obviously got nothing to compare it to, but, Ollie now at 8 has an incredible sense of adventure. He loves travel. He loves new places. He's inquisitive about the world. He has memories of, going to different countries when he was very young. And I think, different strokes for different folks, but it's certainly what worked for us.
What's important to your self-care?
Yeah, great question. I think, as a speaker, speaking of routine, it's not very routine. So, as you would know, sometimes some weeks you're busy traveling, like I'm this tomorrow going to Cairns and then to New Zealand. And I think that it's in the moments and the weeks where things are super crazy. I might instinctively feel like I'll just get through this week, or I won't worry about going to the gym until I get through this week. And what I've learned is that it's in those times of chaotic busyness that self-care is the most important thing. And rather than thinking it's just another thing that I can put to the side till the end of the week or the end of the month, that's the times I need to lean in and double down on it. So, and I don't have it perfect, but I haven't cracked the formula yet. But I just, and particularly as I'm getting older, I think that really self-care around nutrition and exercise and sleep and diet has certainly become more and more important.
How do you fit exercise into your busy routine?
I prioritize it, and I probably make it hard for myself because I set stupid, crazy public goals. So most people know that I'm doing a half marathon in 4 weeks' time, and I deliberately set that goal and deliberately made it public to keep me accountable. So yeah, you can't go into a half marathon without any training. I won't be setting any speed records. I'm telling you that. My goal is to finish it without injury. But it's just prioritizing and scheduling it in like you would schedule an appointment rather than sort of seeing what's left over. I used to have a very leftover approach to fitness, and now I have a priority approach. So I schedule it in like a meeting. So, going to the gym this morning was in the diary, because if it's not in the diary, it's unlikely to happen.
Yeah, there's a Peter Goldwitzer from New York University, and he said if you decide when and where you're going to do it, the chance of it happening is 300% greater than not doing it, sort of thing, which really, really reinforces your point.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also, the 5-minute rule is, running, for example. And I don't actually enjoy running that much. I'm not a runner, but I know that when I do it, I kind of enjoy it afterwards. While it's happening, I'm often not enjoying it, but it's a mental game, right? So I just did a 10K race last weekend, which was really hard because I have a strained glute and, dodgy hip. And it was totally a mental game for me. But if I know that if I don't feel like going for a run, I'll just say to myself, just do 5 minutes. And if you don't want to keep going, you don't have to. So making those little deals with myself as well are important.
That's a great tip. You shared previously that, you had lost your parents.
Mm.
How do you keep a bond of people around you? How do you build relationships that nurture you?
Good question. I think as I get older, I've realized that you don't need lots of friends. You need a handful of really good friends. So I think as I've gotten older, probably what I've done is deepen my relationships and contract the number of those deep friendships and grown my connections. Whereas I think a lot of people try and and I certainly when I was younger probably did it a little bit in reverse. So I've contracted my inner circle, if you like, but expanded my connections. And, family is often the friends that you choose. So, yeah, I'm very lucky that I've got some people who I consider family.
So how do you deepen those relationships with a fewer people? Is it just catching up regularly, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, I think it is, again, starts with prioritizing and making those people a priority. And again, I don't have it all sorted. I don't have it perfect, but I just know that if I prioritize spending time with those people and being present with those people, that fills my cup. And probably, yeah, as I get older, it's become more and more important. And I think that was, for me, I got very, very sick a few years ago with sepsis. And I think, yeah, that really crystallized for me that at the end of the day, when you're facing a near-death experience, as I was, the things and the people who are really important get really clear.
Mm.
And there's not many of them. There's a handful of things and people that are really going to matter, and that really do matter. So I wouldn't recommend facing death to go through that process to identify it, but it is a worthwhile exercise to go, if I were happen, touch wood for something, for me to pass away tomorrow, would I be happy with the legacy I left, the people in my life, the work that I did? And you do realize when you go through that exercise that a lot of the things that you think are important and that you spend time on are actually not that important.
Yeah. Some people who had or have had a near-death experience talk about, a profound change, seeing light, time standing still, being able to see themselves. Was that what it was like for you?
A little bit. I was very, very sick and I wasn't expected to survive. So I had sepsis that they couldn't find the cause of, which was kind of made it a little bit baffling for everyone. And yeah, it kind of got, I had 8 days in ICU. Third night, they just basically, said I wasn't going to survive the night. Because my main inflammatory marker, which in any healthy person sits below 5, if it goes over 5, it means you're unwell. My main inflammatory marker was at 187, which, is most people will die at 160 or at least have all 4 limbs amputated. And interestingly, when it was all kind of over, and obviously I survived it, the very last antibiotic they tried worked. They said to me at the end that the only explanation they have for how I survived it was my baseline fitness, because I was training for a marathon. So
Wow.
that's when you realize that, your health, and that's why I probably prioritize and schedule fitness, because it is, if you find yourself in a situation where you have to make a very sudden and very major withdrawal from the health bank, the credits you have in that bank are everything. So it's not, being healthy and fit isn't just about how you look and feel today. It's an insurance policy potentially for a moment in time.
Thank you for sharing about that. With regards to culture and the culture that does feel good for employees, one of the big things we have as a human is a need to feel that we belong. How do you see good organizations, creating connection and belonging and care in teams?
Great question. And I unearthed a couple of examples for my book, a couple of case studies where employee engagement, which is obviously a huge challenge in corporate Australia right now. People have never been more disengaged. They've never felt more burnt out. They've never felt more like they don't belong. It does come back often, and it's not the only thing, but having a culture of collaboration is really important, and empowering your team to co-create and reimagine your processes, your customer experience, that can have a huge impact, not only on the way they then take those customer experiences to market in a store, retail sense, or however it is that they're interacting with your customers and clients. It actually gives them a sense of ownership and can massively impact retention. For example, Oscar Wiley, which is an Australian optometry brand. It hasn't been in the market that long, and they've sort of come in and disrupted, what was a market that was pretty much dominated by 2 brands. I shopped at Oscar Wiley a few months ago, and when I had a great experience with the optometrist, and then when I was choosing my frames, I realized that all the glasses frames were not model numbers as they usually are. Like, that wasn't the R6720 model. They all had names on them. So it could be the Gabrielle or the Graham or the Amanda. And the woman then went on to tell me this beautiful story about how every year, every Oscar Wiley employee across the country gets to submit a name that's important to them. And they're the names that are given to the new range of frames. And I thought, what a clever, very simple, but very clever engagement strategy, very clever retention strategy. Because if I work at Oscar Wiley, and there's a frame in the store that's the Ollie frame, I'm going to think twice about being poached by a competitor, or I certainly feel valued, and it's a daily visual reminder that that you're very much part of this business, and you're part of what brings it to life.
Yeah, I really love that, because it's not just, as you've said, it's not just about feeling that you contributed something, you're part of something, but it's also part of a shared future. It's thinking about we're co-creating the future, sort of frame or a name or what have you. One of the really critical parts about collaboration that works well is if there's, really strong psychological safety, and that's where people feel free to offer ideas and know that they won't be shot down. It also means that they are free to challenge ideas that they don't think will work. How have you seen some of your clients apply and build that sort of psychological safety?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think psychological safety, when you are building a culture of collaboration, it has to be, a key building block to it, because there's no point in empowering and encouraging your teams to think creatively and innovatively if they are then, either those ideas are shot down, or they're reprimanded, or there's negative consequences for those ideas, even if they are not the right ideas or feasible or commercially viable ideas. I think smart leaders and caring CEOs are the ones that foster that and create safe environments for that thinking that may, as I said, not always be right, but there's not any negative consequences. And in fact, it's the thinking that's rewarded, not the idea. And I think that that's the distinction that, that caring leaders demonstrate.
It's been great catching up, Amanda. I can't believe how quickly the time has gone.
I know.
I did also want to mention that I've also been very fortunate to benefit from your mentoring, your marketing advice, and as have a number of other speakers as well. And it's been great. You've done a fantastic job of building a community of those who do want to, have a really big impact. I always finish by asking the same question, and that is, what do you wish you could tell your 18-year-old self? Knowing your knowledge, your insights, your setbacks, your experiences, what advice would you give your 18-year-old self?
Yeah, I think this is such a good question. And I think for me, my 18-year-old self, I would just say, slow down. It's all going to be okay. And everything that happens for a reason. And, as Gabby Bernstein says, the universe has your back. And, often things, even in the moment, that are painful are meant to be.
That's a great insight. Thanks so much for being part of the Caring CEO, Amanda.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks so much for having me.